welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, alrighty. So we always like to have our guests speak at the beginning, just about the general topic at hand, and then we will ask our questions, and then you in the audience can type in your question, and Kathy will read that question at the end. So not last, but certainly not least. So, Mr. Hamilton, please tell us a little bit about this very complex situation we have. I like to think of it as ethics and logic. Everyone has a heart and an ethical yearning for everyone to be admitted to this country, especially under dire circumstances or at any point that wants the American dream and to come here. But we are a nation of laws, and logically, it's very difficult if we don't have any sort of border. And it's kind of a mess right now. I'm from Texas, so I know that they're really, really troubled in Texas right now with what's happening. So I'm a little closer to home with it. And I heard someone the other day on the news say, well, people think it's just a border state problem, but it's really not a border state problem because this is affecting the entire United States. So we want to keep this not political, but just logical. Where are the ethics and where's the logic in this situation? And where does it begin with our states' rights and our federal, national United States Constitution? So we're going to turn it over to you to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit for us.
Well, great. Well, thanks again, Janine, and everyone for having me on. This is, in fact, one of the areas that a lot of the public cares very much about, in that there's a lot of dynamic and intricate laws and constitutional provisions that are at issue, and that we have folks dealing with on a daily basis across the country. You have a lot of situations where you have, as you said, a lot of folks who have a lot of empathy and a lot of understanding and support for, basic human, the basic human condition of wanting to make a better life for yourself, for your family. But there's also laws. We're also a nation of laws, and it's at this intersection where you see so many things on a daily basis across the country and in the news that really is the intersection of these kind of competing issues, these competing interests. We are a nation of laws. And one thing that's really important for everyone to understand is that we are likely the most generous country in the world when it comes to our lawful immigration system. A lot of folks don't know that the United States of America issues a little bit over 1 million green cards every year to people who are invited into this country, who are put on words after 5 years of having your green card. You can apply for citizenship into society and welcomed as a productive member of society and part of the American family. So 1 million people a year, that's a lot. It's a lot of people. That's a lot of folks. And so when you juxtapose that against what's at the border and the number of people who are crossing unlawfully, of course, as Janine, as you said, for a lot of people, it can pull at your heartstrings. Oh, well, this person or that person, maybe they're just in search of a better life. The place that they come from doesn't have as much economic opportunity. All those kinds of issues, and you feel for that. But every nation across the world, every nation has laws on the books about citizenship, about immigration. To the extent that they can, they enforce them. And the United States is no different. So touching on a couple of little things, or not little things, but a couple of background points. When you think about the way this country was formed, it's not the federal government that formed the states. I think I heard that you all recently had a little bit of a discussion on one of your recent topics about federalism. And it's an important point to keep in mind, because it is the states that came together and formed the federal government. And you see that reflected throughout the Constitution, and this division of powers, not only within the federal government itself, but as allocated between the states and the federal government. And for the longest time, I think folks assumed and they understood that the federal government, based on the duty for the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, or other related provisions in the Constitution and in our many, many, many laws that Congress has passed since our country's founding, that we would never be in a position where a state would have to think about ways to defend itself from external factors in a way that is troubling. And it really, and as Janine, as you say, in Texas and across the country, there's a lot of people who are very, very concerned about the situation that's ongoing. And we have to think to ourselves, what's the right outcome? What's the right mix? Because on the one side, there is a school of thought that says, well, there's a provision in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. And it's present in lots of case law and otherwise, that the federal government has primacy when it comes to immigration matters over the states. The state, that's not to say that the states don't have a role. The states are themselves sovereign entities. Again, it's worth noting that the states formed the federal government. They are sovereigns. They didn't lose their status as a sovereign entity, although of course, under our legal system, the federal laws and the federal Constitution are the supreme law of the land. So what is it that is to be done when you are a state like Texas and you think that the laws aren't being enforced, and you see the laws not being enforced? Do you have the right and the ability as a state, as a sovereign, to defend your own borders? Or is that the federal government's job, and exclusively the federal government's job? And how do you make the federal government, if that's your position, then how do you make the federal government do its job? These are a lot of issues that are kind of ongoing and things to think about. It's very, very complicated. There are all kinds of political, social, human, economic dynamics that are at issue. But ultimately, I think we're going to probably see a lot of those issues start to play out. You've already seen some of them start to play out in the court system. And I should say, just pause there, that I'm here in my personal capacity right now and not on behalf of my organization. But you do see a lot of states now suing the federal government to try to get them to comply with their obligations under federal law, or what the states assert are their obligations under federal law. And I think that over the next year or two, we're likely going to see a lot of action in this space, and we're going to see a lot of cases and issues that are presented to the courts to decide. It's important to note that courts don't just answer any question under the sun. They don't just answer questions because they feel like it or because it's an interesting question. There has to be a live case or controversy. And so it's a lot of information, and it's a lot of things to put there. But I think we are finally at a place where we are likely going to see a number of these things actually get heard by courts. And we're going to see a lot of interesting results from those decisions. And it presents an opportunity for a lot of good debate and a lot of good sharing of ideas. And it'll be fun to see what plays out over the next few years here, especially.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was really, terrific. And I was thinking, we had these questions out on social media. I want to give the answers. What's the length of the U.S. border? It's 7,458 miles. There you go. Which of the three states does not border any country? Another country, Idaho, New Hampshire. It's actually Louisiana is the answer. And how many states border other countries? So 17 of our states border it had to be, well, anyway, other countries. So that's really interesting. 17, that's quite a few states. We really don't think of it that way. Well, I'm very curious what Jewel and Jordan Tova have to ask you, and our guest and Kathy. but I just, and so these are, I'll toss out some questions and quick answers so that everybody has a chance to share, asking you. You're like our genie in a bottle today, right? The questions. Talk to us, the audience, about, it's the executive branch that's in charge of immigration, from what I know, but the legislative branch also should be creating legislation to help with this situation, and nobody wants to because it's become a political issue. I mean, if you go back only just 8-10 years, you had Democrats saying they wanted a wall, and Democrats were saying they believed in immigration, and Hillary Clinton and Schumer and all of them were saying it. But now supposedly it's this political thing. It's just like wearing a mask or not wearing a mask during COVID. It just becomes so political that there's no logic about anything anymore. But talk to us about the executive branch's role, the legislative branch's role, because really it probably shouldn't be the judicial branch's role. Immigration. I don't think the founding fathers wanted to give the border issues or protection issues to the judges, right? Because then you're really not dealing with a representative government. You're just sort of dealing with maybe some elected judges making a decision on something, when I think they really intended that to be more in the folds of the electoral process. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, that's a great question. And the Constitution, while it does say that it's Congress's responsibility to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. There's some interesting work, I think, and interesting reading for folks who are watching this. Good after this is done, in the days and weeks ahead, you can read up a little bit about the history of immigration in the United States at the time of the founding, and how it's eventually shifted a little bit and come to kind of the modern era. But there most certainly is a role for Congress to play to establish the rules of naturalization, which has been interpreted to include everything that comes before naturalization. So your visa processes and everything else, but also the enforcing our borders. And it is traditionally, in any country, in any sovereign group, in any sovereign country throughout history, the executive, the sovereign, or if it's not a constitutional republic or a democracy like ours, the monarch. Every country throughout history has recognized and enforced their borders. And you see this replicated throughout history. Borders have existed for centuries, for millennia, quite frankly. And it has always been the inherent responsibility of the group that is carrying out the executive functions to enforce those laws and to carry out those laws and to protect those borders. And so there is a role for the executive branch to play in administering this system, in faithfully executing the laws that the Congress passes. The Congress, of course, can pass a lot of laws, and they have. The Immigration and Nationality Act is an incredibly complicated and long set of laws. It is very, very, very detailed. And I know a lot of folks on all kinds of different ends of the spectrum have issues with the way that it was written. In a lot of ways, it can seem unjust. In a lot of ways, it can seem too generous. In a lot of ways, it can seem arcane. But there are laws that were passed by the Congress and that the executive branch has an obligation to execute. And it's in that space, it's in that area where we can see some interesting, issues arise. And so what happens if Congress passes a law that the executive branch doesn't want to enforce? Or what happens when the executive branch wants to enforce those laws, but Congress gets mad, or members of Congress get mad at the executive for enforcing those laws, but they never change them? And what happens when you're a state and you look and you see that the executive branch is not enforcing those laws, and that the Congress is not doing anything else to help the situation? And so you get a lot of complicated issues, and there are no necessarily easy answers to these situations. I personally think there are a few easy answers. I think that the rule of law is important. That's me. And I think that the executive has a responsibility under the law as described by the Constitution to faithfully execute those laws. And if they don't like the laws, they can change them. The Congress can change them. But it's at the intersection of this willingness or unwillingness by the executive to enforce those laws that we see reactions on all sides of the spectrum, depending on how those laws are enforced. And of course, as you mentioned, this is not an area where traditionally the judiciary has wanted to be in, and it certainly isn't necessarily always the proper role for the judiciary to be involved in these disputes. And that's where you've seen a lot of these fights play out in courts historically, is that the courts will end up saying, well, look, this is a political issue. This isn't a legal issue for the courts to resolve. Now, they've had some things that some cases have held that in the past, but there have been important cases where the courts have stepped in and decided concrete, discrete legal issues that have arisen. And so it's under that paradigm, under that umbrella, that big picture of you have an executive that has to carry out the laws, you have a legislature that writes the laws, and then what happens when those laws are enforced or not enforced, and what's the judiciary's role, and how do the states relate to that? There's a lot of complicated issues that are at stake, but it's interesting and it's fun. I think maybe not everybody, but I've certainly spent my share of time in this space.
Well, yeah. Okay. I want to share the stage, so I'm not going to ask any more questions. But if I have a moment, because we're a little bit early to come back, I would like to know sort of what the laws are now that aren't being enforced. But you don't have to answer this right now because it's a disaster right now. There was a border control chief of whatever who's resigned, who just said 150 countries, people from 150 different countries are coming across the border now. There is no border in the South. They're coming from all over, and it just can't be enforced. There aren't enough people, and it's fine to have people come in and immigrate here. And that's where the message gets so messy, is if you just want people to abide by the laws, suddenly you don't have a heart. So it gets really, really complicated, but it's a mess down there. And I think I'm going to toss it to Tova, but in closing of my thought processes here, I think that when you leave people defenseless, and when you have majority of people having to obey the laws and other people don't have to obey the laws, it creates a lot of resentment. When you tie the hands of people that are trying to do their job legally but can't, that's when things happen. That's what I mean. You're leaving. The state of Texas can't even protect its own state. It's messy. It's just a mess. It's just a total and complete mess. And it's all political. It's political. It's just like wearing a mask. It's just become a political issue.
So
issue. Okay, Tova, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wondering, what exactly are the state's grievances with the federal government? Because you say that, the federal government isn't enforcing the law, but what does that mean? Like what laws are not being enforced? Because, the federal government can't exactly control how many people come to the border. And so could you talk about what exactly those grievances are?
Sure, absolutely. So under our laws, under our legal system, Congress has said you can't come here unlawfully. If you boil it down to real simple terms, there's hundreds of pages of laws that basically say you can't cross the border unlawfully and enter into the United States. In fact, there is a statute, multiple statutes on the books that make that a federal crime to do. And so when the federal government doesn't enforce the laws that are supposed to be used to prevent people from coming into the United States unlawfully, then states get upset. And they get upset because they bear a lot of costs associated with people coming into their states. and you're talking about education, you're talking about healthcare costs, you're talking about all kinds of other issues. And there are citizens and lawful immigrants who reside within these states, who the states have the first and foremost duty to care for. And when you're talking about dealing with, a limited pool of resources that a state might have, it gets people upset when they think about, well, gosh, why I'm here, I'm working, I'm following the law, I'm paying my taxes. And yet, somebody who didn't follow the law is getting into the country and they're getting into my community, and their perception that they're being given something, it raises a lot of passions. The way that I would think about it, I think, at a very just fundamental level, is just imagine you have a house. And your house is a beautiful house, and you have a nice family that's there, and you're very welcoming. You have house parties at your house on occasion. You let people come in. Some people come in permanently. So say maybe you adopt a child, or maybe you have a family member friend who comes in to live with you. You have people who stay for a short period of time for a dinner party, and then they leave. And I think everyone can kind of understand that general concept. Well, now imagine that at your house, people keep breaking in, keep breaking in the front door or the back door or the side doors. And they don't necessarily do, all of them aren't necessarily meaning you any harm. They're just coming into the house, and they're coming in and they're using your stuff and using your space. And you're a generous person. And if someone ever knocked on your door and asked you for food, you would certainly, I think most folks would oblige, and they would try to do what they could to help a person out. But if someone keeps breaking into your house and breaking in and breaking in and breaking in and violating your house rules, I think that probably somewhere northwards of 99% of people would get annoyed. They would get perturbed at that fact pattern happening in their house. And that doesn't make them a mean person. And it doesn't make them an evil person. It just means that they have a house and they have rules in that house, and that they should get to control and decide who comes into their house and who doesn't. And so I think when you think about it at a very fundamental level, that's really the easiest way to think about the issue as it relates to folks who are upset about the border being unsecure.
I just want to jump in real quick, Tova. Can you go back to, because I think it answers Tova's question. Can you go back and hone in just for a very, very quick answer so we can go back to Tova? We have federal laws that if someone crosses our border illegally, they are what? And these federal laws, we do have federal laws that you cannot come into our country illegally. But I think Tova was asking about the people that are asking for asylum, which is a whole nother ball game. But the people that are coming in illegally, we do have federal laws that are supposed to be enforced. What are those laws?
Absolutely. So 8 U.S.C. section 1325 is a federal statute that makes it a crime to enter the United States unlawfully. It's a misdemeanor for the first offense. 8 U.S.C. 1326 makes it a federal crime, punishable as a felony, to come into the United States unlawfully after you've been previously deported. There's a whole lot of statutes in Title 8 generally. 8 U.S.C. 1225 is a general statute that governs the admission or the admissibility of people who are encountered along the border. And so you have, if you've been to the border, and I would encourage everyone to take a visit whenever you're able to with your family or whomever, and to lay eyes on what the border actually is and what it actually looks like. Because there are things called ports of entry, and those are like doors. Think of it as a doorway that lets you into the country. And then there's a lot of things, a lot of area, a lot of land miles and space that are between the ports of entry. And you're not supposed, the laws say, in short, basically, you are not supposed to come in those areas between the doors. You're not supposed to come into the country unlawfully. It's unlawful.
I just wanted to know what's being enforced and what's not being enforced. If you can just answer like in 15 seconds. We have these people that are coming across illegally, but we're not holding up to those laws, right? They're going to sanctuary places. We're not arresting. I mean, what's going on? And then I really wanted to go back to Tova. So 15 seconds. Please.
Yeah, so 15 seconds is that if you cross the border unlawfully, then the result is you should be deported. Now, there are exceptions to that if you have a claim for asylum or if you have some other things. And it's in these exceptions that the laws are not enforced. And it boils down to when the law says in almost every circumstance, someone who comes between those ports of entries is supposed to be deported very quickly from the United States, but they're not. Those are the laws that are not being enforced. The
Okay.
Laws that say this person shall be removed.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Tova, go ahead.
Yeah, so when you say that they're not being enforced, I'm just a bit confused about that. Like, what's the like what are you referring to when you say they're not enforced? Because I assume that, border enforcement is operating under similar laws. They're not just having open borders. So when you say they're not being enforced, are you saying that, less people are being deported compared to the previous administration, or that, like what specific actions by the federal government are you referring to when you say it's not being enforced?
And I just want to step in here and say before you answer, there are a lot of people getting into the country that we just can't catch. And I think that's a big problem. When you come in a porous border, we don't even know who's getting into the country and we can't even catch them. So we can't even enforce the law if we wanted to because they're getting into the country. Isn't that a big part of the
Right,
problem?
well, I'm just saying so I'm just wondering, what is the specific difference between the policies that you're objecting to?
So while not trying to get too political, the current administration has directed under this thing called prosecutorial discretion, which means that they're saying, look, in our thinking, we can't enforce the laws against everybody. So we're only going to focus on this smaller group of people. And it's under that line of logic, under that line of thinking, that they allow a lot of people to come into the country who the laws say shouldn't be able to stay in the United States. And there are all kinds of really detailed and difficult sub-issues underneath that general topic. But if you just boil it down to the very, very basics, it's about allowing people to get in who are qualified to get in. It's about allowing people to stay who are allowed to stay. And it's about deporting or removing people from the country when the law says that they should not be able to stay. And if you boil it down to that very basic premise, everything else flows from that. There's all kinds of different debates, and there's all kinds of different issues, sub-issues under that can be discussed and that can be debated. But it really comes down to when a federal law says that someone who comes into the country unlawfully should not be here. It is, what does the government do about that? Does the administration of whichever political party in power try its best to enforce those laws and to make sure that it's generous and that you're allowing people to come in lawfully, but that you are actually deporting people who violate those laws? It's how do you do that as a government? Are you willing to do your best? Are you willing to try to enforce those laws? Or if you instead, as some folks would say right now, if you have a disagreement with those laws and you decide, well, I'm just not going to, I don't like them. I don't like the way they were written. I think they're mean. I'm not going to enforce them. That's a different dynamic and that's a different issue. And so I think that what we see right now from a lot of people in a lot of states is that they are upset that what they view is that the federal government is not upholding its end of the bargain. It's not making sure that the people who come in unlawfully or who violate the laws while they're here are forced to leave the United States when they violate those laws. And that's as almost as basic as you can get it, because there's just so many complicating dynamics underneath that underneath that kind of larger umbrella that we could talk about. But that keeping it very, very simple, that's really the way that I would say that you should think about the issue and those underlying dynamics between the different administrations.
And then I was also wondering what the difference between the asylum process, which is legal, right, versus the illegal immigration processes, and like, is there a different way people who seek asylum are supposed to apply, and how do you differentiate illegal immigrants from people who either are valid asylum seekers or in their minds think that they might be eligible?
Well, now that is a very good question, and it's one that a lot of people, a lot of smart people don't fully appreciate, I think, and really think about it in that way. So I'm glad you asked it. There, as I mentioned earlier, federal law makes it a crime to come into the country unlawfully. There's no excuses in that federal law that makes it a crime to come into the country unlawfully. So if your purpose is to come here and seek asylum, federal law says you don't do that by coming across the border unlawfully. You don't do that by coming in illegally. What you do is you go to one of these places that we talked about a minute ago, which these ports of entry. It is not a crime in any way, shape, or form for someone who wants to seek asylum or protection in the United States to go to one of those ports of entry and to go up to an officer at that port of entry and say, hey, I'm Joe Smith, and I'm facing political persecution in my home country. Please let me have my case heard here. And there's a lawful way to do that. And there are many cases like that all the time, every day, across not only the southern border, but the northern border and some of our other ports of entry across the country. Even when people are flying in from abroad and they land at New York airport or at the Atlanta airport or elsewhere, there's a lawful way to do it. Coming across the border unlawfully, just because you want to seek asylum doesn't make the coming across the border unlawfully not a crime. An important point, though, is that once you're here and once you're in the United States, even if you've committed a crime, even if you've violated the immigration laws, you still have the ability to say, hey, look, instead of deporting me, I want to ask for asylum here. I have a case. I'm, face persecution at home or whatever. And so the federal government has to consider that case before they then deport you. They give you a chance to make that case. But it's this underlying misunderstanding among many smart people that think that coming across the border unlawfully is somehow the right way for people to come and ask for help, and it's just not. And if you go back again and you think about it as a house, and if you had someone knocking at your door and asking you for food, your willingness to let them in and to give them food and to help them and assist them is a very different scenario than somebody who breaks in your window and takes your food and then you're left with that type of a situation. And so there's a lot of things to think about there. And but that is.
I need to interrupt you so I can get to Jewel and Jorn, because everyone's supposed to have like 10 minutes. And
sure.
Jewel and Jorn, I want you to have and we got to get Kathy in here too. So go ahead, Jewel and Jorn.
All right, thank you.
We just need to keep our answers really short, so everyone, because Jewel needs to ask questions and Jorn needs. So thank you, Jean. We're just kind of sorry to interrupt. We're just on this time clock. Okay, go ahead.
So as far as the states enforcing federal law, we just did a series about the anti-federalist papers. Before that, we did series about natural law. And I think that this topic intersects both of those. We talked about how a sovereign nation has the right to control immigration to that nation. And then you talked about how the states are technically, they are sovereign states who then created the federal government, not the other way around. So we enter a compact where we agreed that the federal law was also going to follow the laws that they passed to bind them. Now, the state is not being protected by that federal government in that state's eyes. So in the spirit of the Constitution and in the law of the Constitution, wouldn't the state have the right then to enforce that law?
Well, it's a very good question. And it's one that has a lot of interesting answers, depending on who you ask. I think some people might remember, or they might have heard about a case where Arizona about 10 years ago passed some laws that were challenged by the then Obama administration. And then you had a Supreme Court decision that said, in more or less, that Arizona didn't have the right to kind of create its own immigration system, didn't have its right to kind of create its own immigration laws and its own penalties for violating those laws. But Arizona did have the ability to do certain things that were kind of concurrent with those federal laws. And so the states, as it relates to the states, the question that you brings up a lot of interesting other issues, which is, what does it mean in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution for the federal government to guarantee against states that you'll protect them from invasion? What does that mean? Does that mean an armed invasion? Does that mean an invasion of people who are unlawfully coming into the country? And if that's the federal government's job and the Constitution gives it that job, and the federal government doesn't want to do that job, then what remedy does a state have? And that brings up all kinds of really complicated issues. But it's really something that I think that we will see play out here probably over the next couple of years, because of the amount of frustration that we're seeing from states about what they're seeing and what they perceive is happening at the federal level.
Are you aware of any particular historical events where maybe a state militia defended itself against maybe an Indian invasion, or even just controlling its border when before the Louisiana Purchase or after, or anything like that?
Well, so there are different examples throughout history, and that's a really good question, by the way, of governors calling up their state militias or the state national guards to take care of insurrections and to take care of other things that are happening. I don't have any precise examples that I could give you about it being from kind of outside of the state invading force coming into that state. That's something I'd have to think about, but it's a very good question.
All right, George's got a question for you. Thank you.
So if states were given the chance to control their own borders, you can kind of assume that, say, California will allow more immigrants in than Texas would. From that standpoint, then, with this dichotomy, how would state borders then travel to stopping immigrants from California to Texas when they were accepted in California? How does Texas then hold its line from immigrants coming from other states within America?
Well, that is also another really good question. All the questions today have been really good and really insightful. So y'all should be very, very happy with yourselves for thinking through these issues. Look, under the Constitution, when we're talking about lawful immigration, the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, it really, I think most folks would agree on, relates to the ability to welcome people in through the lawful channel, so that you don't have a patchwork of laws that apply to people depending on which state that they come into in the first place. But I think that's a different dynamic than a state, particularly a border state's ability to prevent people who didn't come in a lawful way to coming in within their borders, or to providing services or certain things to people who violated those federal laws or violated the other otherwise applicable laws, and the obligations that it puts on those states when that happens. And so it's whether it's you're talking about kind of the lawful process or the unlawful process, I think that there's a little bit of a interesting thing to think about there. I won't comment necessarily on my own personal views on it, but it really raises some important questions for folks to think through. And if you think about it that way, I mean, it would be very complicated to have a system where each state has its own system of immigration. That would be fairly complicated.
I think we have to pass it over to Kathy, correct? Some audience questions.
Yes, well, thank you, Jordan and Jewel, and thank you very much, Jean. And actually, so many of the audience questions, Jean, you've already answered in your comments. But I do want to read a comment from Beverly Roberts. She says, the house analogy is perfect. I use it often. I live in Texas. So great analogy there. And then Professor Klinger had a question that I thought was really interesting, and I'd never heard this before. The professor says, under the precedent of Heckler versus Cheney, non-enforcement is not generally considered to be justiciable. And what I think he may mean by that is non-enforcement is not considered alone cause for court to take action, which I didn't realize that. He says non-enforcement may be challenged when statutory language makes action compulsory. So I guess is Professor Klinger saying that if you write an immigration law, you have to say that it must be enforced or that action must be compulsory, or else the executive branch could decide not to enforce it?
Well, that's a very good question. And Professor Klinger has hit something that is an important thing to think about. And that is that when Congress gives the executive some amount of discretion to exercise in carrying out a duty, it's not the court's place to come in and then tell the federal executive branch how it has to carry out that duty. If Congress gives the executive some flexibility, it's not the judiciary's role to step in and second guess. But there's always a but in legal world. The immigration laws in particular are full of laws that speak in mandatory terms. There's a lot of shalls. There's not a lot of mays. There are some mays, but especially when it comes to protecting the borders and enforcing the laws, there are a lot of shalls. You shall do this, or this shall happen to this type of a person. And so it's in those contexts where the courts do have a standard by which they can judge whether the government's doing its job or not, based on what Congress told it to do. But it's absolutely the case. He's exactly right that there are some examples where under Heckler versus Cheney, the judges are going to defer a lot to the executive branch's decision-making.
Okay. And then we had a question, and I don't think we've talked about Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. John Peeler asks, and that specifically says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or the foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. And what John Peeler says is, given the dangers of COVID, illegal drugs, human trafficking, and other criminal enterprise, can the mass influx across our southern border be defined as an invasion? And he says Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of our U.S. Constitution gives states the right to defend themselves against invasion.
So it's a really good question, and it's a cousin, that provision is a cousin question, I think, in the Constitution to Article 4, Section 4, which is where the federal government has this obligation to prevent these invasions. And so I think it's going to depend on the situation, and it's going to depend on what's happening. I don't think I could answer definitively if states, to when it happens, that a state's rights to defend itself on its own with its Article 1, Section 10 powers that are recognized there, when those kick in and when they don't. What I can say is that, I think that there are at least very good arguments that could be brought that the federal government is failing in its duty to enforce its Article 4, Section 4 responsibilities. And just by way of historical fact, kind of a little fun point for everybody on today's call, just to get at what Janine was going at earlier, this wasn't always such a political issue. It wasn't such a political hot potato. And back in 1997, California had challenged a number of things that the federal government was doing, and they're trying to recover costs that California was incurring from the presence of a lot of illegal aliens in California. And they brought their case, and they got denied by some of the courts because largely the court said, well, this is a political question and we're not going to answer it. But when California presented the case to the Supreme Court and asked for the Supreme Court to take it, and side note, the Supreme Court didn't take the case, one of the people who signed a brief asking the Supreme Court to take the case, because of Article 4, Section 4 issues, was none other than Senator Dianne Feinstein, who said, this is a really important issue for you to address, court. You need to determine whether or not California is being invaded. Now, fast forward to the year 2021, from 1997, just 24 years have passed, and I don't know that necessarily we would see the same kind of brief submitted by Senator Feinstein today, but it is an interesting issue to think about, and it is an interesting historical factual point.
Yeah, great points. Well, we only have about 2 minutes left. Janine, would you like to wrap us up?
I'm just thinking about Tova because I feel like she's a surrogate daughter of mine. And I feel like I can feel what you're thinking, Tova. But I think in closing, because I know you have a call at 3, so very quickly, Tova, if I'm not mistaken, I think what's very confusing is that people are coming and claiming asylum. And so all these people, the 15,000, the 25,000 are coming. It's very hard to explain to people that they're just seeking asylum. And so it's legal to do that. So what's illegal? Am I right, Tova? I think that's one of the things that's confusing for someone of her age and for a lot of people with the heartstrings. Well, they're just claiming asylum, and what's illegal about that? So can you answer that in 30 seconds?
It would largely relate to some of the stuff I said a moment ago, which is that what ultimately matters, you should not violate the law in trying to obtain your objective. You shouldn't ever do something illegal to get a benefit. And so if you go to the port of entry, there is a lawful way to do that and to seek asylum. If you come into the country unlawfully and you ask for asylum, you've done it the wrong way. You've committed a federal crime in the process, and it's not the way that it's supposed to work. Because if you think about all of the resources that have to be devoted, Border Patrol agents trying to stop people and catch criminals in the process, because not everybody's just an asylum seeker. Not everybody's coming here for the right reasons. A lot of people, there are a lot of nefarious actors, and you can see it every day down at the border. And so it's separating these people out amongst each other. And then at the end of the process, if your system is going to have any integrity, if it's going to have any meaning whatsoever, it's that if you qualify for asylum, you're welcomed into the country and you're given a process to become a citizen. But if you're not, if your case is denied, you should be deported at the end of that process. You should be sent back home or somewhere else, not here, because you no longer have a lawful right to stay here. And where the rub comes in is that historically speaking, statistically speaking, about 25% of all asylum cases get granted. it's less than that for people coming from the Northern Triangle and from Central America. And so you have a situation where you have a lot of people who want a benefit, they want something, they want to build a better life, but the law says, sorry, you don't qualify. And so in the interim, there's all kinds of resources that are spent from Border Patrol agents, from everybody else, trying to enforce our laws and trying to do all these things, because people came here unlawfully the wrong way, and it causes all kinds of complications. So if you go to the port of entry, there's a process, there's a way you can do it. You can ask for asylum, you can ask for help.
But what's happening is there's an influx of so many people, they're having to let them in anyway without even really able to see if they qualify and say, come back to us in 6 months, and then the majority of them don't.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the problem. So, well, I think everyone on this call cares about people in the world and wants everyone to live the American dream and everybody to come here and be a part of the American dream. I don't think anybody thinks differently than that. It's just how do we do it is the big question. And Jean Hamilton, I think you're a saint. I think it's very hard. It's a very, very hard topic, and you did a great job of staying non-political and trying to help us reason our way through it. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. I really love all these questions. Y'all are doing great work here, and really appreciate all the attention and everyone's time.
Well, we thank you. We thank you for your time. I'll let everybody say goodbye to you really quickly. Tova.
Hi, thank you.
See ya. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks, everybody,
Thanks,
for listening.
appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Jean.
right.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
It's Kathy. Thanks, Jean. We know you have a 3 o'clock call. Appreciate you. Thanks, Jewel and Jorn, as always. Wish y'all had more time. Kathy, we want to talk about next week's show?
Yes, and I want to answer a question you asked me earlier, because you asked me how many chats we had, and I gave an incorrect answer. This is actually our 90th constitutional chat. And we've had actually 117 online programs, if you count our book clubs, our founding document forums, and our live Constitution Day Zoom. So 117 total, 90 constitutional chats. We want to invite everybody to come back next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Our special guest is going to be Steve Moore. You've seen him on TV many times, and we're talking about a really hot topic about the IRS having access to your bank account. And Janine, you might want to flesh that out a little bit more. But
right. Well, they're saying if you, the IRS in this new bill they're trying to pass in Congress right now, that Congress will have the right. This is why bills shouldn't be so big. Congress will have a right to go into your bank account and look at any check over $600. That's what's in the bill. That's just crazy. And Jewel and Jorn, next week, I'm going to start with y'all. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to let y'all start.
Okay. All right,
Yeah,
ready. We'll try to be ready.
yeah, I'm going to let y'all go first. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.